About 2 months ago, I was in our library here on campus looking through the magazines. And I came across this one magazine I hadn't read before. It was this one, The Atlantic. And what drew me in was the title, Is Democracy Dying? This is a question that a lot of people across the world are beginning to ask themselves. It's a question that's coming up as a result of the threat many perceive that is coming from the authoritarian forces in our society. That's what I want to talk to you about today. But before we start discussing, we need to define certain terms. The first of which is liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is a political system which focuses on individual rights and personal freedom and protects these and recognizes them by law. The second definition is authoritarianism, which is also a political system but focuses on obedience to authority and a lack of personal freedom. Essentially, you can see these two as polar opposites. Liberal democracy is the system most of us here are used to, and it's the one used across most of the Western world. So, to understand what's happening today in our political situation, we need to first look back about 100 years to the period between the two world wars. At this time, Europe was in shambles. There were food shortages, and the Great Depression had just hit. People were desperate for change, willing to do almost anything to make their lives better, even if that meant sacrificing their freedom. This was the ideal breeding ground for radical political thought. And out of this, authoritarian groups grew. They promised easy solutions to the problems people were facing. But, as always with authoritarians, these easy solutions came at a cost. The cost? Personal freedom and democracy. The growth of authoritarian political systems led to a rivalry between political systems, which culminated in the Second World War. The authoritarian states lost, and the fascist ideas were dismissed. Instead, a new rivalry came out. The rivalry between liberal democracy on one hand and the communist system on the other. When the USSR, the representative of the communist system, fell in 1991, people across the Western world proclaimed the end of history. Liberal democracy had proved itself to be the superior system, the most sustainable and successful one. Nothing else could rival it. By internalizing this view of an end of history, we embraced the narrative that political scientists would call a politics of inevitability, meaning that we saw a certain political development is bound to happen. In this case, it would be the growth and development of liberal democracies worldwide as inevitable. After all, liberal democracy had proved itself to be the most sustainable system, right? That may be true, but that quickly fades from people's minds. This view of a development as inevitable leads to an unsettling comfort. We start taking our systems for granted, we stop questioning them, and we dismiss the alternatives. As the author Timothy Snyder would put it, when we start taking our freedom for granted, we do not recognize the threat of those who want to take it away from us for what it is. when we start trying to solve our problems with easy solutions, when we do not recognize the intentions behind the changes that certain groups are trying to push through, whether that be quietening your political opponents or restricting immigration, we are falling right into the arms of authoritarians. And now, like the last time it happened, the cost will likely be the same: personal freedom and democracy. If you think this is not happening already, you're wrong. It is. In countries like Poland and Hungary, far-right authoritarians have been in government for several years now and are making changes to the judicial system, the amount of presidential terms, and even to the constitution. All these are signs of a democracy that is withering. The most probable thing that will come out of this, the most probable thing that will happen in the future, is what has already happened in the past. The last time this happened, our democracies fell, and World War II came out of it. But since then, we have seen less fighting. We've seen a growth of democracy worldwide, through, for example, the UN, through increased cooperation instead of separation. We've seen less fighting than ever before. For me, as a European, the greatest example of this cooperation is the European Union. The European Union was created after the Second World War to create peace and stability for Europe. This would be achieved through European integration, a process of cultural, political, and economic exchanges between various European countries. Judging by the fact that we haven't had a war within the European Union for the last 70 years, many say that it's pretty successful. But personally, this is not the only reason why I believe in it. The reason why I believe in the European Union is because I've seen it working firsthand. Both my parents come from Sweden, but moved to Luxembourg to work for the institution. Growing up in Luxembourg, I went to a European school, a school with people from all across the continent. It wasn't perfect. It had its problems, and there are a lot of differences and divisions between people of different nationalities. But what I can tell you is that people from my school know others from all over Europe. That people in my school can recognize almost any European language as soon as it's spoken. And that people whose grandparents were killing each other only 75 years ago are now friends. The European Union itself isn't flawless. It's bureaucratic, and frankly, there's a lot of waste. But what it has achieved is peace through European integration. The European Union is not the only institution to have done this. The UN and other regional unions like the African Union have also done this. But with the problems we're facing nowadays, the belief in these types of institutions is falling. When you feel a threat from an invasion or a massive amount of foreigners coming into your country, then European cooperation is no longer important. Then, instead, it's easier to turn to the people with the easy solutions. Then, it's easier to turn your back on liberal democracy and choose authoritarianism. To turn your back on cooperation and choose separation instead. This is the development we're seeing today. So, is this the end of liberal democracy? Well, it can be. If we do not study our history, we are bound to repeat the mistakes our ancestors made in a very similar situation. But if we do, if we learn from the mistakes they made, we can prevent this. One thing that is important to learn is that when authoritarians are gaining power, one of the worst things we can do is to be passive. If we do not want our personal freedom to be restricted, we need to take action. We need to question the changes that are being made. We need to discuss and debate with these people. And we need to defend the institutions that we want to uphold. Because, frankly, if we don't, we can no longer ask questions like this. Thank you.